A janitor, mocked, ignored, and dismissed, just ran into gunfire to save the cop who humiliated him. Why would he risk his life for someone who treated him like trash? This is the story of an invisible man who became a hero and the redemption no one saw coming. Before we dive in, hit subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. Stories like this remind us that heroes wear all kinds of uniforms. Invisible, the fluorescent lights of the Lincoln Heights police station buzz overhead, casting a sterile glow over the scuffed linoleum floors. It was 7 a.m., and the precinct was already alive with the sounds of ringing phones, gruff laughter, and the occasional screech of a chair being pushed back. Luis Rivera moved through the chaos like a shadow. At 52, his back had begun to protest the long hours of bending and lifting, but he never let it slow him down. His mop glided in smooth, practiced arcs, erasing the grime of the night shift. He worked silently, eyes down, his presence as unnoticed as the hum of the vending machine in the corner. Officers milled around him, their voices loud and careless. A few tossed crumpled papers in his direction, missing the trash can on purpose. Luis didn't react. He simply picked them up and disposed of them, his face unreadable. Then came Dan Harper. Dan was the kind of cop who filled a room just by walking into it, broad-shouldered, loud, the kind of guy who clapped people on the back too hard when he laughed. He strode into the break room, still hyped up from some adrenaline-fueled arrest, his boots tracking mud across Luis's freshly mopped floor. "Oops," Dan said, not sounding sorry at all. He smirked at his partner, a younger officer named Riggs. "Better clean that up before someone slips, huh?" Riggs chuckled, tossing a candy wrapper onto ground for good measure. "Yeah, wouldn't want a lawsuit." Luis's grip tightened on the mop handle. He could feel the heat creeping up the back of his neck, but he kept his voice steady. "I'll get it." Dan raised an eyebrow, amused. "Damn right you will. That's what they pay you for, isn't it?" The word stung, but Luis had heard worse. He bent down, wiping up the mud without another word. Around him, the station buzzed on, indifferent. In the locker room later, Luis allowed himself a moment of quiet. He opened his locker, where a single photograph was taped to the inside, a younger version of himself in a paramedic's uniform, standing beside his brother in their hometown of San Juan. Back then, he had saved lives. Now, he cleaned up after people who barely saw him as human. He traced the edge of the photo with his thumb. He had come to the States with dreams of continuing his work, only to be told his certifications didn't matter here. His English wasn't perfect. His experience didn't count. So he took what he could get, a mop, a bucket, and a paycheck that barely covered rent. A sudden burst of static from the dispatch radio snapped him back to reality. All units, armed robber in progress at the quick stop on 4th and Main. Suspects reported as armed and dangerous. Luis's pulse jumped. That was just 2 blocks away. Outside the locker room, Dan and Riggs were already gearing up, joking like they were heading to a barbecue instead of potential shootout. "Hope they don't make too much of a mess," Dan said, slamming his car door shut. "Wouldn't want to stress out the cleaning crew." The cruiser peeled out of the lot, sirens wailing. Luis stood there, the mop still in his hand, the echo of Dan's laughter ringing in his ears. Something inside him tightened. He wasn't just a janitor. And today, maybe, just maybe, he'd prove it. Gunfire. The Quick Stop's flickering neon sign cast an eerie glow over cracked pavement as Luis stepped out of his rusted pickup truck, the bouquet of flowers for his daughter's birthday tucked carefully under his arm. The air smelled of gasoline and rain-soaked concrete, the kind of morning that felt heavy with something unsaid. He had just pushed open the convenience store's door when the first gunshot shattered the stillness. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack that sent Luis's instincts screaming. He dropped to the ground behind a shelf of chips as glass exploded inward, raining shards across the floor. His heart hammered against his ribs, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. 2 masked figures stood near the register, their guns raised. The clerk, a middle-aged man with wide, terrified eyes, had his hands in the air. "Empty the register. Now!" One of the robbers barked, his voice muffled by the black fabric covering his face. Luis pressed himself lower, his mind racing. He had seen violence before, back in San Juan. in the alleyways where gunfire was as common as the sound of stray dogs barking at night. But this wasn't home. This was supposed to be safer. Then came the sirens. The robbers whipped around at the sound, their movements frantic. "Cops!" the taller one hissed. Outside, tires screeched as 2 squad cars skidded to a halt. Doors flew open, and officers took cover behind their vehicles, weapons drawn. Luis recognized Dan Harper's voice before he saw him. "Lincoln PD, drop your weapons and come out with your hands up." The robbers didn't hesitate. Gunfire erupted, a rapid, staccato burst that sent Luis's pulse into overdrive. Bullets tore through the store's front windows, shattering coolers and sending cans of soda spraying in all directions. He could hear the officers returning fire, the sharp pop-pop-pop of handguns mixing with the deeper thud of the robbers' weapons. Then a cry of pain. Luis dared to lift his head, just enough to see. Dan Harper was down. The officer was slumped against the side of his cruiser, one hand clutching his side, where dark blood seeped through his fingers. His face was twisted in pain, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The other officers were pinned down, unable to reach him. Luis's body moved before his mind could catch up. He didn't think about the bullets. He didn't think about the fact that this was the same man who had mocked him less than an hour ago. All he saw was a life slipping away. He dropped the flowers and ran. The world narrowed to the pounding of his own footsteps, the roar of gunfire, the metallic scent of blood in the air. He reached Dan just as another volley of shots rang out, the bullets kicking up asphalt near his feet. Dan's eyes, wide with pain and shock, locked onto his. "You!" he choked out. Luis didn't answer. He grabbed Dan by the vest and hauled him behind the cover of a parked truck, his muscles screaming in protest. Dan groaned as his back hit the pavement, his face pale beneath the sheen of sweat. "Stay still," Luis ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He ripped open Dan's shirt, revealing a deep, ugly wound just below his rib cage. Blood pulsed out in a steady rhythm. Too fast. Luis knew that rhythm. He'd seen it before, in the streets of San Juan, in the back of ambulances where lives slipped through his fingers. He pressed his hands against the wound, applying pressure. Dan hissed through his teeth, his body jerking. "Damn it!" "You're lucky," Luis muttered. "Missed a lung. But you're bleeding bad." Dan's breath came in short. Pain burst. His eyes, glassy with shock, flickered over Luis's face as if seeing him for first time. Why are you?" Luis didn't answer. He didn't have time. The gunfire had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then footsteps. One of the robbers was moving toward them. Luis's blood went cold. He could see the man's shadow stretching across the pavement, hear the crunch of broken glass under his boots. Dan's gun was still holstered. Luis wasn't a cop. He wasn't even supposed to be here. But he wasn't about to let either of them die. He reached for the weapon. The robber rounded the corner, his gun raised, then froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the robber's grip on his weapon faltered. "Luis?" Luis blinked, his finger hovering over the trigger. The voice was familiar, too familiar. The robber yanked off his mask, revealing a face Luis hadn't seen in years. Javier, a kid from the neighborhood back in San Juan. A kid he'd once helped when his mother was sick. Javier's eyes darted from Luis to the wounded officer, then back again. His face twisted in something like shame. "What the hell are you doing here, man?" Javier hissed. Luis didn't lower the gun. "Javier, walk away." Javier hesitated. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder. Then, with a curse, he turned and ran. Luis exhaled, his hands shaking. Dan stared at him, his expression unreadable. "You know that guy?" Luis didn't answer. He just pressed harder against Dan's wound as the first paramedics finally arrived. The aftermath, the fluorescent lights of Lincoln General Hospital buzzed like trapped insects, casting a sterile glow over the crowded waiting room. Luis sat stiffly in a plastic chair, his hands clasped between his knees, the scent of antiseptic and stale coffee thick in the air. His shirt was still streaked with Dan's blood, rust-colored stains that had dried stiff against the fabric. Around him, the precinct had descended upon the hospital in a wave of blue uniforms and hushed voices. Officers clustered in tight groups, murmuring updates, their eyes flicking toward Luis every few seconds. He could feel their stares like physical touches. Curious, wary, disbelieving. The janitor, the one who ran into gunfire. A nurse had tried to clean him up earlier, pressing a damp cloth into his hand was soft. "You're a hero." Luis had only shaken his head. He wasn't a hero. He'd just done what anyone would have done. Except no one else had. The doors to the ER swung open, and a woman rushed in. Rachel Harper, Dan's wife. Her blonde hair was disheveled, her face pale with fear. She zeroed in on the nearest officer. "Where is he? Is he okay?" "He's in surgery," the officer said, guiding her to his seat. "But the doctors say he's stable. He's going to pull through." Rachel's knees buckled with relief. Then her gaze landed on Luis. Recognition flickered in her eyes. "You," she breathed. Luis tensed, unsure what to expect. Anger? Blame? Instead, Rachel crossed the room in 3 quick strides and threw her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for saving him." Luis froze, his arms hovering awkwardly at his sides. He hadn't been hugged in years. Before he could respond, a camera flash blinded him. A reporter, a sharp-eyed woman with a microphone, had slipped into the room. "Mr. Rivera, can you tell us what happened out there? Why did you risk your life for Officer Harper?" Luis blinked against the glare of lights. The room had gone silent. Every ear tuned to his response. I just did what was right," he muttered. The reporter leaned in. "But sources say you and Officer Harper had a strained relationship. Is that true?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Luis's throat tightened. He didn't want this. Didn't want to be the center of attention. Didn't want to drag Dan's name through the mud when the man was still fighting for his life. "No comment," he said quietly. Across the room, Riggs, Dan's partner, snorted. "Yeah, real heroic," he muttered just loud enough to carry. Guy probably just wanted his 5 minutes of fame. Luis's jaw clenched, but he stayed silent. Rachel, however, whirled on Riggs. "Shut up," she snapped. If it weren't for him, Dan would be dead. Riggs held up his hands in mock surrender, but his smirk remained. Luis stood abruptly. "I should go." Rachel caught his arm. "Wait, Dan will want to thank you. Please." He hesitated, then nodded, but he couldn't stay in that room, under those stairs, for another second. He slipped out into the hallway, the hospital's AC raising goosebumps on his skin. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Marisol. "Poppy, you're on the news. They're calling you a hero." Attached was a blurry screenshot of a news headline. "Janitor saves cop in brazen shootout." Luis's stomach twisted. He didn't want to be a headline. He just wanted to go home. But as he turned the corner, he nearly collided with Chief Malone, a grizzled man with a reputation for zero tolerance. The chief studied him for a long moment. Then, to Luis's shock, he extended a hand. "Rivera, right? I've been hearing a lot about you today." Luis shook his hand cautiously. "Sir, you've got guts," Malone said, "running into gunfire like that." Luis shrugged. "I used to be a paramedic in Puerto Rico." Malone's eyebrows rose. "Is that so?" Before Luis could respond, his phone buzzed again. Another text, this time from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have gotten involved." Luis's blood ran cold. He looked up, scanning the hallway. Had Javier followed him here? Malone frowned. "Everything all right?" Luis quickly pocketed the phone. "Yeah, just family stuff." The chief nodded, then clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, don't be a stranger. We owe you." As Malone walked away, Luis exhaled shakily. He pulled out his phone again, staring at the message. This wasn't over. And somehow he knew the hardest part was yet to come. The interview. The studio lights burned hotter than Luis had expected. He sat stiffly on the edge of a plush maroon couch, his palms damp against his knees, while a makeup woman dusted powder across his forehead. The scent of hairspray and coffee hung thick in the air. "You're live in 5, Mr. Rivera," a producer said, adjusting an earpiece. "Just answer the questions naturally. Naturally, as if any of this was natural." Luis had never imagined sitting across from Diane Morales, the most famous news anchor in Lincoln Heights. Her smile was polished, her gaze sharp enough to cut glass. Behind them, a large screen displayed the now viral image of Luis kneeling beside Dan in the parking lot, blood on his hands. The floor director counted down silently. 3, 2, 1, and Diane's expression softened into practiced warmth. Welcome back. We're here with Luis Rivera, the man who risked his life to save Officer Daniel Harper during yesterday's deadly shootout. Luis, thank you for joining us. Luis swallowed. Thank you for having me. Diane leaned forward. Tell us, what was going through your mind in that moment? The question should have been simple, but the truth was tangled. Memories of gunfire in San Juan, his brother's lifeless eyes, the way Dan had laughed at him just hours before. I saw someone who needed help, Luis said carefully. It didn't matter who it was. A flicker of surprise crossed Diane's face. Even though reports indicate Officer Harper had been unkind to you in the past, the studio seemed to hold its breath. Luis's fingers tightened around the armrest. He could lie. He could play the saint. But the words came out raw instead. Everyone deserves a second chance. For the first time, Diane's perfect composure slipped. The camera zoomed in as tears welled in Luis's eyes. Not for the interview, not for the audience, but for the brother he couldn't save all those years ago. The moment shattered when Diane's phone buzzed violently on the coffee table. The producer frantically gestured at the monitor, where Dan Harper, pale but alert in his hospital bed, was being patched in via satellite. Officer Harper, what an incredible surprise. Diane recovered smoothly. You're watching your rescuer's interview? Dan's image wavered on screen. His voice came out hoarse but clear. I needed to say this while everyone was watching. Luis froze as Dan's gaze locked onto us through camera. I was wrong about you. Rivera and I... A cough racked Dan's body. When he continued, his voice cracked. I don't deserve what you did for me. The studio erupted into murmurs. Diane opened her mouth, but Dan wasn't finished. They're discharging me tomorrow. First thing I'm doing? Resigning from the force. Gasps filled the room. Luis stood abruptly, knocking over his water glass. Dan. But the screen had already gone black. Chaos erupted. Producers shouted. Diane scrambled to salvage the segment. And through it all, Luis's phone vibrated nonstop. Marisol reporters, unknown numbers. Then one text stood out. You should have let him die. Jay. The studio lights blurred as Luis stumbled back. Javier wasn't just watching. He was waiting. And Luis suddenly understood. Saving Dan had made him a hero to the world. But to Javier, he'd just made himself a traitor. Redemption. The rain fell in heavy sheets as Luis stood on Dan Harper's porch. The yellow glow of the porch light cutting through the evening gloom. He'd been standing there for a full minute, hand raised to knock, but unable to make contact. What exactly was he doing here? The door swung open before he could decide. Dan stood in the doorway, his face still pale from the hospital, his right arm in a sling. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. The cop and the janitor, the saved and the savior. You gonna come in or just keep drowning on my porch? Dan finally said, stepping aside. The warmth of the house hit Luis first. The scent of fresh coffee and something baking in the oven. Rachel appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. When she saw Luis, her face lit up. Luis, thank God you came. She rushed forward, pulling him into a hug that smelled like vanilla and home. Dan's been pacing all day waiting for you. Dan scowled but didn't deny it. Rachel ushered them into the living room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. The walls were covered in family photos. Dan in uniform, Rachel laughing at the beach. 2 golden retrievers Luis remembered Dan mentioning once. A life so different from his own tiny apartment with its second-hand furniture and quiet loneliness. Dan sank into an armchair with a wince, gesturing for Luis to take the couch. You saw the interview. Luis nodded. You really resigning? Yeah. Dan picked at the edge of his sling. Turns out nearly dying makes you rethink some things. His eyes met Luis's. Like how you treat people. Rachel set down 2 mugs of coffee between them. He's been writing apology letters all week, she said softly. Starting with you. Dan shot her a look, but reached for an envelope on the side table. His fingers trembled slightly as he held it out. Luis took it, the paper thick and expensive under his fingers. He could feel them both watching as he opened it, as he read the messy handwriting that didn't match Dan's usual confident scrawl, weakened by pain meds and something else. Regret. Rivera, I've been a bastard. Not just to you, to a lot of people. I thought the badge made me better. Turns out it just made me blind. You saved my life when I didn't deserve saving. If there's ever anything. Luis folded the letter before he could finish. His throat felt too tight. There is something, he heard himself say. Dan sat up straighter. Name it. Your brother. The one who died in Iraq. Luis watched Dan's face go still. Tell me about him. The fire popped. Rachel quietly left the room. Dan's voice, when it came, was rough. Mikey, he was a good one. Always sticking up for little guys. A bitter laugh. Guess that's why he enlisted. Wanted to save people. Luis nodded to the photo on the mantel. A younger Dan and a smiling man in military dress. My brother Carlos was like that too. Understanding passed between them, wordless and heavy. Two men who'd lost their compasses, who'd been drifting ever since. Dan cleared his throat. That EMT job you wanted. Malone's fast-tracking your application. Luis blinked. What? Turns out saving a cop's ass makes the department move quick. Dan attempted a grin, but faltered. You deserve it. More than most of us deserve these badges. Outside, the rain slowed to a gentle patter against the windows. Rachel returned with a plate of warm cookies, the kind Luis's mother used to make. Stay for dinner, Dan said, and it wasn't a question. Luis looked at the fire, at the family photos, at the two people watching him with something like hope. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He took a cookie. Okay. This story proves that courage and compassion can bridge even the deepest divides. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, heroes come in all forms. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of the good in the world.